A racist police officer points a gun at a black woman during a routine traffic stop, completely unaware that she is a retired lieutenant general of the United States Army. How does such a moment unfold? How does someone who has spent their life defending justice respond when faced with such blatant prejudice and abuse of power? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Cecilia Harris, a 60-year-old retired lieutenant general of the United States Army, was a woman who carried the weight of her 3-decade-long military service with quiet dignity. Known for her unshakable courage and decisive leadership, she had commanded respect not only among her peers, but also from those who served under her. Her chest bore the honors of countless medals, each a testament to her sacrifices and unwavering commitment to her nation. Since her retirement, Cecilia had embraced a solitary life. She was unmarried and had no children, choosing instead to dedicate herself entirely to her career. Her home was modest, decorated with mementos of her service, a framed photo of her platoon, a folded flag, and plaques commemorating her achievements. While the world lauded her accomplishments, her personal life remained understated, defined by routine and introspection. She preferred the quiet comfort of her mornings, reading newspapers over coffee, and long walks through the neighborhoods of the city she called home. One crisp morning, the phone rang. On the other end was Robert Carter, the charismatic and affable mayor of the city. "General Harris," Carter's voice carried an unmistakable warmth. "My family and I would be honored if you could join us for dinner tonight. My wife and children have heard so much about you, and we'd love the chance to express our gratitude in person." Cecilia hesitated briefly before responding, her tone measured yet friendly. "That's a kind invitation, Mr. Mayor. I'd be delighted to join you." The conversation was brief, but it left Cecilia with a sense of anticipation. Though she valued her privacy, she understood the importance of connections and took the invitation as a rare opportunity to step out of her routine. That afternoon, Cecilia prepared for the evening with precision, as she had approached every task throughout her life. She selected a tasteful but simple outfit, formal enough to respect the occasion, yet understated, reflecting her practical nature. Among her belongings, she found a small eagle statuette, an elegant representation of freedom and courage. It had been a personal gift from a colleague years ago, and she thought it a fitting gesture to present it as a token of her appreciation for the mayor's kindness. Her car, an aging sedan with faded paint and the occasional dent, a vehicle that had seen years of practicality over luxury, stood waiting in the driveway. Cecilia slid into the driver's seat, her movements fluid and deliberate. The engine roared softly to life, and she began her journey through the quiet streets of the city. The road ahead was serene, flanked by rows of neatly trimmed trees, and glowing with the golden hue of the late afternoon sun. As she drove, Cecilia's thoughts wandered briefly to her time in service. Memories of commanding troops in hostile terrain, making life-or-death decisions, and mentoring young soldiers came flooding back. Despite the hardships, she felt an enduring pride in having lived a life of purpose. Tonight's dinner was a rare moment to reflect on those years with people who appreciated her sacrifices. A small yet meaningful acknowledgement. Yet, what began as an uneventful drive was about to take a sudden and unexpected turn. As Cecilia approached an intersection, she noticed the faint glint of police lights flashing in her rearview mirror. A patrol car had appeared behind her, its siren blaring a sharp, intrusive wail. Confused but calm, Cecilia pulled over to the side of the road, her disciplined instincts guiding her actions. She checked her mirrors, watching as the officer exited his vehicle. His stride was purposeful, almost aggressive. Even from a distance, Cecilia could sense the tension in his body language. She rolled down her window as he approached, bracing herself for an interaction that would soon disrupt the tranquil evening she had anticipated. What awaited Cecilia on that quiet road was more than a routine stop. It was a confrontation that would challenge her patience, principles, and the very justice she had spent her life defending. Cecilia Harris adjusted her rearview mirror as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated her car's interior. The patrol vehicle screeched to a halt behind her, its siren silenced, but its authority loudly implied. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the steering wheel as she glanced out the side mirror. A white police officer in his early 30s emerged, his movements brisk and authoritative. His name badge read Turner, and his demeanor immediately struck her as antagonistic. Michael Turner approached the driver's side, his boots crunching on the gravelly roadside. Without any preamble, he rapped on her window with the side of his flashlight, the metallic knock carrying an air of impatience. Cecilia lowered the window halfway, her expression calm but guarded. "License and registration," Turner barked, his tone clipped and dismissive. "Good evening, officer," Cecilia replied evenly. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Turner's lip curled into a smirk, his eyes scanning her face briefly before darting to her car's interior. "This isn't about questions. It's about following instructions. License and registration. Now." Cecilia's eyes narrowed slightly, her years of military training keeping her voice measured. "I'm happy to cooperate, officer, but I'd like to understand the reason for the stop first." Turner leaned closer, his hand resting casually on the top of her car door. His smirk faded, replaced by a harder, condescending stare. "You want to understand? Fine. You're driving a beat-up car through a neighborhood where people like you don't usually belong. That's reason enough to make sure everything checks out, isn't it?" Cecilia's jaw tightened. The insult was thinly veiled but unmistakable. "Officer," she said firmly, "this vehicle is registered in my name, and I'm on my way to a dinner invitation. I've broken no laws, and your assumptions about me are irrelevant." Turner let out a short, mocking laugh. "Dinner invitation? Let me guess. Some charity handout or a church gathering? Doesn't really matter. Show me your ID, or I'll have to assume you're hiding something." Cecilia's voice remained steady, though the tension in her chest began to build. "Assumptions like that have no place in professional law enforcement, Officer Turner. Unless you can articulate a valid reason for this stop, I must insist on my rights as a citizen." Turner's expression hardened. "Rights?" he repeated, his voice tinged with derision. "Listen, lady, I'm the one who decides what's valid here, not you. If you've got nothing to hide, hand over your papers, and we can both move on." When Cecilia remained unmoved, his frustration bubbled over. "What's the holdup? Is there something in this car I need to know about?" His gaze swept over the back seat as if expecting to find contraband or some other justification for his actions. "Officer, I've been patient," Cecilia said, her tone edged with resolve. "But I won't hand over my documents without a lawful explanation for this stop. If you're unwilling to provide one, I suggest you call your supervisor." Turner's hand dropped to his hip, hovering near his holstered firearm, though he didn't draw it. The gesture was deliberate, a silent threat meant to intimidate. "You think you're calling the shots here?" he sneered. "I don't take orders from you, and you don't get to dictate how this goes." The air between them thickened with unspoken tension. Turner's face flushed with anger as he straightened, taking a step back and crossing his arms. "Let me make this simple for you," he said, his voice sharp and condescending. "Either you cooperate, or I'll drag you out of this car myself and take you down to the station. How does that sound?" Cecilia exhaled slowly, her composure unshaken despite the mounting hostility. "It sounds like you're abusing your authority," she replied. "And if that's your approach, I'll have no choice but to report this incident." Turner's eyes flashed with indignation. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "Go ahead, report me. See how far that gets you. People like me? We run this system. People like you. You're just passing through." Cecilia held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I've faced men with far more power than you," she said calmly. "And I've never backed down when I knew I was in the right. Tonight won't be any different." Her words struck a nerve. Turner's smirk returned, but it was colder now, devoid of humor. "You think you're special, huh? Just another self-important—" He stopped short as a movement caught his eye. On the sidewalk a few feet away, a young woman had paused, her phone raised. She was recording. Turner's jaw tightened as he realized the interaction was no longer private. "Hey!" he shouted, pointing at her. "Turn that off and move along. This is official business." The woman hesitated, glancing between Turner and Cecilia. "It's a public street," she said cautiously, her voice carrying an edge of defiance. Cecilia seized the moment. "You're well within your rights," she called out to the woman, her voice steady but firm. "Stay at a safe distance, but keep recording." Turner's face darkened. "You think this is a game?" he snapped at Cecilia. "You're only making things worse for yourself." Cecilia met his anger with unyielding calm. "I'm making sure the truth is documented," she said. Turner took another step back, clearly flustered by the growing sense of accountability. But instead of de-escalating, he doubled down. "You're not walking away from this," he muttered, his hand once again drifting toward his hip. Turner's patience was running thin, and it showed. He stepped back from Cecilia's car, his hands on his hips, his face a mask of indignation and frustration. "You think you're somebody special, don't you?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Driving around here acting like you belong. Let me tell you something, lady. You're nothing but an old woman trying to look important in a car that's one step away from the junkyard." Cecilia's expression remained composed, though her eyes flashed with quiet resolve. "I don't need your approval to be here, Officer Turner. What I do need is for you to start respecting the law you're sworn to uphold." Turner scoffed. crossing his arms tightly. Respect? Don't make me laugh. Respect is earned, and I'm not seeing anything worth respecting here. His gaze swept over her car again, his lip curling in derision. You're out of your depth, lady. Maybe people like you get away with things where you come from, but not here. Cecilia recognized the veiled racism in his words. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. People like me? She asked, her tone cutting, but controlled. I've served this country for over 30 years, defending the rights of people like you to abuse your power. And now you stand here, trying to strip me of the same rights I fought to protect. Does that sound fair to you, Officer Turner? Turner leaned forward, resting his palms on the edge of her car window. Don't try to lecture me about fairness, he snapped. You're just another know-it-all who thinks the rules don't apply. Well, here's a reality check. They do. And tonight, I'm the one enforcing them. As Turner's temper flared, a voice interrupted from the side of the road. Hey, is everything okay here? Both Cecilia and Turner turned to see a young woman standing on the sidewalk, her phone raised and recording. Sarah Johnson, in her mid-20s, had been walking home when she noticed the altercation. Her face was a mixture of concern and determination. Turner's eyes narrowed. Turn that off, he barked. This is official police business. You're interfering. Sarah didn't flinch. It doesn't look official to me, she said, her voice steady. It looks like harassment. Cecilia seized the opportunity. Miss, she said, her tone calm but authoritative. You have every right to record this. Just make sure you stay at a safe distance. Turner whirled back to Cecilia, his face flushed with anger. You think this is funny? You're encouraging her to stick her nose where it doesn't belong. I'm encouraging her to document the truth, Cecilia replied evenly, something you seem eager to avoid. Turner took a step toward Sarah, his body language aggressive. I said turn it off, he growled, his voice lower now, a clear threat. Or what? Sarah shot back, refusing to lower her phone. You'll arrest me for standing on a public sidewalk? Cecilia's voice cut through the rising tension. Officer Turner, I suggest you reconsider your actions. Threatening an innocent bystander only adds to the misconduct you're already guilty of. Turner snapped back to her, his hand resting dangerously close to his holstered gun. You don't get to tell me how to do my job. Cecilia's gaze didn't waver. And you don't get to rewrite the law to suit your prejudices. Every step you take toward intimidation only proves you're unfit for the badge you wear. The standoff escalated further when Turner slammed his hand against the roof of Cecilia's car. The sharp thud echoed through the night, startling even Sarah. Enough of this, he barked. Hand over your license and registration now, or I'll haul you out of this car myself. Cecilia's voice remained firm. And on what grounds? You've failed to provide a single legitimate reason for this stop. Your actions are not just unethical, they're illegal. The law applies to you too, Officer Turner. The words seemed to push Turner over the edge. Illegal? He repeated, his voice rising. Let me show you what illegal looks like. His hand moved quickly, reaching for the handle of Cecilia's car door. But it was locked. Turner yanked at it angrily, his frustration mounting. Unlock the door now! Cecilia stayed calm, her hand hovering near her phone. You've already escalated this far beyond protocol. I'm not giving you any more opportunities to violate my rights. Turner's face contorted with rage. He turned back to Sarah, who was still recording, her phone unwavering despite her obvious nervousness. You're complicit in this, he snarled at her. If you don't stop filming, I'll arrest you for obstruction. Sarah held her ground, though her voice trembled slightly. Go ahead and try. I'm pretty sure this video will tell a different story. The impasse stretched into a tense silence, the three of them locked in a standoff that felt like it could snap at any moment. Turner's authority was crumbling under the weight of his actions, but his ego wouldn't allow him to back down. Cecilia broke the silence. Officer Turner, you're digging yourself into a deeper hole with every word and every action. I'm advising you, as someone who understands discipline and accountability, to stop before it's too late. Turner's eyes flicked between Cecilia and Sarah, the gears in his mind clearly turning. He was outnumbered, not in force, but in the power of truth. Yet instead of de-escalating, he took another step toward Cecilia's car, his hand once again brushing against his holstered weapon. The tension snapped. Turner, his face flushed with frustration and ego-driven anger, reached for his firearm in a show of power. The metallic sound of the gun clearing the holster cut through the night like a sharp blade. He pointed it directly at Cecilia through the partially open window, his voice hard and venomous. Out of the car. Now, he barked, his finger hovering over the trigger. Cecilia froze, not in fear, but in measured calculation. She raised her hands deliberately, palms facing forward, showing no intent to resist. Her voice, steady and calm, cut through Turner's rage. Officer Turner, I am unarmed. There's no need for this, she said, her tone resolute yet diplomatic. Lower your weapon before this situation spirals further out of control. But Turner wasn't listening. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the gun tighter, his entire body radiating hostility. I said, get out of the car. Don't make me repeat myself. Cecilia held his gaze, her military training kicking in. She didn't flinch, didn't cower. Instead, she spoke with a commanding authority honed over decades of leading troops in far more dangerous situations. You're making a mistake, she said firmly. This isn't going to end the way you think it will. Turner's face twisted with fury. Shut up! You don't get to talk down to me. His voice was loud now, almost frantic. He took a step closer, lifting the weapon higher. From the sidewalk, Sarah's voice wavered. You're pointing a gun at an innocent woman. What are you doing? She shouted, her phone still capturing every second of the escalating chaos. Stay out of this, Turner snapped, not taking his eyes off Cecilia. Cecilia seized the brief distraction. Keeping her hands raised, she carefully tilted her head downward and pressed a button on her phone, which rested on the passenger seat. Without looking, she speed-dialed the mayor. Turner caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. What are you doing? I said no phones. He stepped closer and slammed the barrel of the gun against the driver's side window. The glass cracked under the force, a jagged spiderweb radiating from the impact point. Cecilia's voice remained calm, though her words carried the weight of a warning. You've crossed a line, Officer Turner. That's destruction of property, and it's being recorded. She gestured subtly toward Sarah, who stood frozen on the sidewalk, her phone unwavering despite her visible fear. Turner let out a low growl of frustration. This is your last warning. Get out of the car or I'll drag you out myself. From the phone, a muffled voice called out, Cecilia, what's happening? Are you okay? Cecilia didn't break eye contact with Turner as she responded. Mr. Mayor, I'm currently being threatened by an armed officer, Michael Turner, without cause. I need assistance immediately. The voice on the other end grew sharp. Stay calm. I'll be there with the police chief in minutes. Don't do anything until we arrive. Turner, realizing she was talking to someone with authority, took a step back, his grip on the gun faltering slightly. Who the hell are you calling? He demanded, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Cecilia lowered her hands slightly, her voice cutting through his panic. Someone who outranks you, she said simply. The words seemed to hit Turner like a physical blow. His face contorted with a mixture of anger and panic, and his hand wavered briefly before he steadied the weapon again. I don't care who you called, he snarled. Right now, I'm the law, and you will do as I say. Cecilia's tone grew firmer, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a seasoned leader. You're not the law, Officer Turner. The law is clear, and you're violating it. If you continue down this path, you'll have to answer for every action you've taken tonight. The words struck a nerve. Turner's breathing grew heavier, his movements more erratic. He glanced back at Sarah, who was now joined by another bystander, an older man who had stopped to see what the commotion was about. Put the gun down, the man shouted. You're going to get yourself fired. Turner's focus shifted momentarily, and Cecilia used the opportunity to take control of the situation. Officer Turner, she said, her voice calm but commanding. You have two choices. De-escalate now, or face the full weight of the consequences. The decision is yours. Turner hesitated, the gun in his hand trembling slightly. His pride and ego clashed with the mounting evidence of his misconduct. The sound of distant sirens broke the silence, their approach unmistakable. Backup was on the way, and Turner knew it. Damn it, he hissed, stepping back and lowering the gun slightly. He glanced toward the flashing lights that were now visible in the distance. Cecilia finally lowered her hands, her eyes never leaving Turner. It's over, she said simply. The screech of tires and flashing lights signaled the arrival of reinforcements. A black SUV came to an abrupt stop near the scene, and from it emerged Mayor Robert Carter and Police Chief David Miller, their expressions taut with controlled urgency. Behind them, additional patrol units lined the street, their sirens cutting off as officers stepped out, visibly tense. Miller wasted no time. His sharp gaze locked onto Turner, who was still holding his gun at his side, though the weapon was no longer raised. Officer Turner! Miller's voice was firm, commanding immediate attention. Lower your weapon now. Turner froze, his knuckles still tight around the grip of the gun. His eyes darted nervously between Cecilia, Sarah with her phone, and the arriving officers. Reluctantly, he holstered the firearm, though his posture remained defiant. I had the situation under control, Turner muttered defensively. Under control? Miller shot back, his tone icy. From where I'm standing, this looks like anything but control. Step away from the vehicle. Turner hesitated, but eventually backed away from Cecilia's car, his jaw clenched. The mayor approached Cecilia's window, his expression softening. "Ms. Harris, are you all right?" Cecilia nodded. "I'm unharmed, but this officer's behavior has been reckless and unwarranted. I've explained the situation to you earlier, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for staying calm," Carter replied before turning his attention to Miller. "I want this handled immediately." Miller nodded, his focus shifting back to Turner. "What the hell happened here, Turner? You pulled a gun on an unarmed woman? On what grounds?" Turner straightened, trying to regain a semblance of authority. "She was refusing to comply, sir. I had reason to believe she was hiding something. She wouldn't show her ID. She didn't need to show her ID without probable cause," Miller interrupted sharply. "And pointing a weapon at a civilian who posed no threat. You've crossed every professional boundary." Turner's frustration boiled over. "I was doing my job. She was acting suspicious, driving this kind of car in this area. She doesn't look like—" "Careful," Miller warned, his tone deadly serious. But Turner pressed on, desperate to justify himself. "She doesn't look like someone who lives around here." I had every reason to believe something was off. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Sarah, still recording, whispered, "He just said it out loud." Carter's face darkened. "You're telling me you stopped her because she didn't fit your idea of who belongs in this neighborhood?" Turner opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing too late the implication of what he'd admitted. "I was just being cautious," he stammered. "That's not caution," Miller said, his voice like a razor's edge. "That's profiling. That's abuse of power. And that has no place in my department." Turner turned to face Miller fully, his voice defensive and shaky. "I've been under a lot of pressure lately. Short staffing, long hours. It gets to you. Maybe I overreacted, but—" Miller held up a hand to silence him. "Pressure doesn't excuse misconduct. It doesn't excuse prejudice. And it sure as hell doesn't excuse pulling a gun on someone without justification." Carter gestured towards Sarah, who stepped forward cautiously with her phone still recording. "You have the incident on video?" Sarah nodded. "Everything. From the moment he stopped her to when he hit her window with his gun." Miller's jaw tightened as he turned back to Turner. "Is that true? You struck her vehicle?" Turner hesitated before muttering, "The situation was escalating. I had to take control." "You escalated it," Miller snapped. "You turned a routine stop into a dangerous confrontation because you couldn't handle someone questioning your authority. That's not policing. That's a disgrace." Turner's face reddened, but he had no response. The silence was broken by Cecilia, who stepped out of her car, her movements deliberate and composed. "Chief Miller," she began, her voice steady, "this officer's behavior tonight goes beyond a simple lapse in judgment. He threatened me, destroyed property, and made it clear his actions were fueled by prejudice. If not for that young woman's courage," she gestured toward Sarah, "this might have ended very differently." Miller nodded, his expression grim. "Ms. Harris, you have my word. This will be handled swiftly and thoroughly." Carter stepped closer to Turner, his tone low but firm. "Officer Turner, you've embarrassed this department, this city, and yourself. If you think there won't be consequences, you're sorely mistaken." Turner's shoulders slumped, but he still managed a feeble protest. "I was just trying to do my job." "Your job?" Miller interjected. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass, intimidate, or abuse. You failed on every level tonight, and now you're going to answer for it." As Miller motioned for another officer to escort Turner away from the scene, Sarah stepped closer to Cecilia. "Are you okay?" she asked, lowering her phone. Cecilia offered a faint smile. "Thanks to you, yes. Your video might have saved more than just my night." Carter turned to Miller. "I expect a full report on my desk by morning, and I want him off duty immediately." "He's suspended effective immediately," Miller confirmed. "An internal investigation starts now." By the following morning, Sarah's video had spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Uploaded with the caption, "This is what abuse of power looks like," it garnered thousands of views within hours. The footage, unfiltered and raw, showed every crucial moment. Turner's aggressive demeanor, his blatant prejudice, and his escalation into violence when confronted with calm resistance. Comments poured in, a deluge of anger and disbelief. Users condemned Turner's actions, demanding accountability and calling for systemic reform. Some recounted their own experiences with similar abuses, while others questioned how such officers could remain on the force. This is exactly why people don't trust the police anymore. If it weren't for Sarah recording, who knows how this would have ended? Turner isn't just a bad apple. He's part of a rotten system. The video reached local news outlets by mid-morning, quickly making headlines. Within hours, it was picked up by national media, turning a single traffic stop into a flashpoint for conversations about racial profiling and police misconduct. At the precinct, Chief Miller convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The mood was tense, the gravity of the situation undeniable. "Officer Turner has been suspended effective immediately," Miller announced to the room, his voice firm. "An internal investigation is underway, and I expect full cooperation. No stone will be left unturned." One of his deputies hesitated before speaking. "Chief, do you think this will blow over? Turner's actions were clearly wrong, but the public outrage—" "This isn't about damage control," Miller cut in sharply. "It's about accountability. Turner didn't just tarnish his badge, he tarnished this department, and I'll be damned if I let his behavior go unchecked." Meanwhile, Cecilia Harris found herself inundated with calls from activists and community leaders. Though she hadn't sought the spotlight, she knew the importance of the moment. In a phone interview with a local reporter, she spoke with her characteristic calm and clarity. "This isn't just about one officer's misconduct," she said. "It's about the broader culture that allows such behavior to persist." Turner acted with impunity because he believed he could. That belief doesn't come out of nowhere. It's fostered by a system that lacks accountability. Despite her reluctance to fan the flames of controversy, Cecilia felt a responsibility to see the matter through. "I'm not looking for personal vindication," she continued. "I want systemic change. If this incident can spark that, then I'll do whatever it takes to make it happen." Human rights organizations quickly rallied behind Cecilia's stance. The ACLU released a statement condemning Turner's actions and calling for immediate reforms within the local police force. "What happened to Cecilia Harris is not an isolated incident," the statement read. "It is a symptom of systemic issues that demand urgent attention. Racial profiling, abuse of power, and a lack of accountability have no place in modern law enforcement." Protests began to take shape across the city. In the town square, a group of activists held signs bearing messages like "Justice for All" and "End Police Abuse." Speeches were given, amplifying the voices of those who had experienced similar injustices. One speaker, a young black man named Jamal, addressed the crowd passionately. "This isn't just about Cecilia Harris," he said. "It's about every single person who's been stopped, harassed, or threatened just because they didn't fit someone's idea of who belongs. Enough is enough. We need change, and we need it now." The growing unrest didn't escape the attention of Mayor Carter. He called Cecilia directly that afternoon, his tone apologetic but resolute. "Ms. Harris, I want to personally apologize for what you endured," he began. "I also want to assure you that steps are being taken to address this." "I appreciate your words, Mr. Mayor," Cecilia replied. "But words alone won't fix this. The community needs to see action. They need to know that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Not now, not ever." Carter paused, then spoke decisively. "There's going to be a press conference tomorrow. I'd like you to attend and share your perspective. Your voice carries weight, and I believe it can help push for the reforms we both want to see." Cecilia hesitated. She wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but she knew the importance of the moment. "All right," she said finally. "If it means holding the system accountable, I'll be there." Back online, the video continued to dominate the conversation. Celebrities and public figures began sharing it, adding their voices to the growing call for justice. "This is why we need police reform," one tweet read. "Cecilia Harris is a hero for standing her ground." The momentum was undeniable. By evening, Trucker Justice for Cecilia was trending nationwide. The public was no longer content with empty promises. They wanted concrete action. The room buzzed with tension as reporters packed the press conference, cameras flashing and microphones poised. Mayor Carter and Police Chief Miller stood at the podium, but it was clear the real focus of the event was Cecilia Harris. The public wanted to hear from her, an unyielding woman who had stood firm in the face of blatant injustice. Cecilia walked to the podium with purpose, her presence commanding silence. She took a deep breath, scanning the room before speaking. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "I stand here today not for personal vindication, but because what happened to me is not unique. It's a symptom of a deeper problem, a systemic issue that affects countless individuals every day, people whose stories never make it to this stage, people who are silenced before they have the chance to be heard." The room was silent, save for the clicking of camera shutters. She continued, her tone resolute. "The events of that night were not just about one officer's actions. They were a reflection of a culture that allows prejudice and abuse to fester unchecked. This isn't just about me. It's about the woman walking home, the man driving to work, the teenager out past curfew. It's about all of us." A reporter stood, his voice cutting through the heavy air. "Ms. Harris, with all due respect, do you think you'd be standing here today if you weren't a retired lieutenant general? If you didn't have the status you do?" The question hung in the air, sharp and direct. A murmur rippled through the audience. Cecilia didn't hesitate. "You're absolutely right," she said, her gaze unwavering. "My rank, my reputation, these things gave me a platform. But that's exactly why I'm here. Because for every person like me who has the privilege of being heard, there are countless others who don't. If my voice can amplify theirs, then I'll use it." She paused, letting her words sink in before pressing on. "This isn't about my rank. It's about accountability. It's about making sure no one, regardless of their status, has to endure what I did. This isn't just my fight. It's a fight for fairness, for justice, and for change." Another reporter raised her hand, her tone probing but respectful. "What kind of change are you calling for, Ms. Harris? What specific actions do you believe need to be taken?" Cecilia leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the sides of the podium. "First, there must be accountability. Officers who abuse their power, like Michael Turner, need to face consequences, not just for the sake of their victims, but for the integrity of the entire system." Her voice grew firmer as she continued. "Second, we need comprehensive reform in how officers are trained. Policing is about protecting and serving, not intimidating and oppressing. Education on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation tactics should be mandatory. And finally, we need transparency. Incidents like mine shouldn't rely on bystanders like Sarah to bring them to light. The system itself should be built to hold its own accountable." A young journalist stood next. "Ms. Harris, there's been a lot of public outcry following the release of the video. Do you think this momentum will lead to real change, or will it fade like so many other cases?" Cecilia took a moment before responding, her voice laced with determination. "Momentum is only as strong as the people who sustain it. It's up to all of us, leaders, citizens, activists, and the media, to ensure that this isn't just another fleeting moment of outrage. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it doesn't happen at all if we don't keep pushing." Chief Miller stepped forward briefly, adding his voice to the discussion. "As Chief of Police, I want to make one thing clear. Turner's actions do not represent the values of our department. We are committed to rooting out behavior like this and ensuring it has no place in law enforcement." A reporter pressed him. "Chief Miller, do you think Turner's actions were a one-off or part of a broader issue in your department?" Miller didn't flinch. "This incident has made it clear that systemic issues exist, and it's our responsibility to address them. That's why we've launched a full internal investigation and will be implementing mandatory bias and de-escalation training across the board. We can't move forward without acknowledging the need for reform." The conversation returned to Cecilia as a journalist posed a final question. "Ms. Harris, do you have any words for the public, especially those who feel powerless to fight against abuses like this?" Cecilia straightened, her voice softening but losing none of its strength. "To anyone who feels powerless, let me say this. Your voice matters. Sarah Johnson's courage to record what happened that night is proof that one person can make a difference. Don't underestimate the power of documentation, of speaking out, of standing up, even when it feels like no one is listening. Change starts with individuals, but it takes all of us to see it through." As she stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into applause. Not the polite kind reserved for formalities, but the genuine sound of a crowd moved to action. Cecilia had not only shared her story, She had called for a collective reckoning. The announcement came swiftly and decisively. Within 72 hours of the incident, the police department issued a public statement. Officer Michael Turner had been terminated from his position and would face criminal charges for misconduct, including unlawful threats and abuse of authority. This department has no tolerance for the kind of behavior displayed by Officer Turner, Chief Miller stated during a press briefing. He betrayed the trust of the public and tarnished the badge he wore. Effective immediately, he is no longer a member of this force. The reaction from the public was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Social media was flooded with posts lauding the decision as a step in the right direction. Activists and community leaders praised the swift action, but also used the moment to highlight the broader issues still plaguing the system. This isn't just about one bad officer, an ACLU spokesperson said in an interview. Turner's actions are a glaring example of systemic flaws that must be addressed. Accountability is a start, but reform is the goal. Meanwhile, Turner's world began to unravel. The media scrutiny was relentless, with his name and face plastered across every major news outlet. Local residents who had once greeted him with casual nods now avoided him entirely. At the grocery store, an elderly woman glared at him and muttered under her breath, "Shameful." A young couple in the parking lot snapped a photo of him, the flash of their phone like a branding iron. The isolation extended beyond strangers. Turner's family, too, distanced themselves. His wife, overwhelmed by the public backlash and their children's questions, moved to her parents' house. His friends, many of whom worked in law enforcement, stopped answering his calls. Sitting alone in his apartment, Turner stared at the official notice of his termination. The accompanying letter from Chief Miller was succinct but damning. It cited violations of departmental policy, breaches of public trust, and actions unbecoming of an officer. Below it, a court summons detailed the charges against him. He crumpled the papers in his fists, his thoughts a turbulent mix of anger and regret. In his mind, he replayed the events of that night over and over, each moment a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. But Turner's reckoning wasn't solely about punishment. As news of his dismissal spread, a surprising outreach came from a local human rights organization. A representative, Aaron Blake, contacted him directly. "Mr. Turner, I'm Aaron Blake with the Civil Rights Alliance," she said, when he reluctantly answered the phone. "I'm reaching out because while we strongly condemn your actions, we also believe in rehabilitation. We'd like to offer you an opportunity to participate in our educational programs on systemic bias and community engagement." Turner was stunned. "You think sitting in a classroom is going to fix what happened?" he replied bitterly. "It's not about fixing the past," Aaron said firmly. "It's about acknowledging it, understanding the harm, and ensuring it doesn't happen again. This is a chance for you to reflect and grow. Whether you take it or not is your choice." Turner didn't answer immediately, but Aaron's words lingered long after the call ended. For Cecilia, the resolution of Turner's case was only one piece of the puzzle. While she appreciated the public's support and the swift action against Turner, she knew that systemic issues ran far deeper. "This isn't about celebrating someone's downfall," she said in an interview. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Turner's dismissal is a step, but it's not the solution. The system that allowed his behavior to thrive must be dismantled and rebuilt with accountability and justice at its core. Her words resonated with the community, fueling ongoing discussions about police reform. Proposals for mandatory training on implicit bias and stricter oversight gained traction, with local officials promising to implement significant changes. Despite the progress, the case continued to spark controversy. Supporters of reform pushed for more comprehensive measures, while a small but vocal minority criticized the department for what they called an overreaction. A retired officer appeared on a local news panel, defending Turner's actions. "The guy made a mistake, sure, but firing him and dragging him through the mud? That's excessive. Policing is a tough job. People need to cut officers some slack." The comment ignited a fresh wave of debate, with community leaders pointing out that tough jobs don't excuse abuses of power. Turner, meanwhile, found himself grappling with the weight of his choices. After weeks of avoiding the public eye, he finally agreed to attend one of the sessions offered by the Civil Rights Alliance. It was a small step, but for Turner, It marked the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward understanding the harm he had caused. At the session, Aaron addressed the group, which included others who had been accused of discriminatory actions. "Acknowledging your bias isn't weakness," she said. "It's the first step toward dismantling it. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes. It's what you're willing to do to make amends." Turner sat in silence, absorbing her words. For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than anger or defensiveness. It wasn't absolution, but it was a glimmer of accountability. Cecilia Harris wasted no time turning public outrage into meaningful action. Days after the press conference, she met with Mayor Carter and a coalition of local leaders, determined to use her voice and experience to spark real change. The meeting was direct and solution-oriented, with Cecilia pushing for reforms that would address the root causes of systemic issues in law enforcement. "We can't just treat this as an isolated incident," Cecilia said, her voice resolute. "This is a moment to implement reforms that will prevent abuses of power, hold officers accountable, and rebuild trust with the community." Mayor Carter nodded. "We need to start with mandatory bias training and a full review of department policies. But we also need to ensure these changes stick, something more than words on paper." "I agree," Cecilia replied. "Training is just the beginning. We need independent oversight, clear disciplinary protocols, and a system where accountability is not optional." In collaboration with the city government and local organizations, Cecilia spearheaded a series of community forums designed to foster dialogue between law enforcement and the public. These forums weren't just symbolic gestures. They were working sessions where residents shared their grievances and proposed solutions directly to police leadership. At one such forum, a young man stood up to speak. "I've been stopped 5 times in my own neighborhood for no reason," he said. "If the goal is to serve and protect, why do we feel like suspects instead of citizens?" Cecilia listened attentively, then responded with clarity. "Your experience is exactly why these reforms are necessary. We need to shift the culture of policing from suspicion to service. It's about treating every person with respect, no matter their background." Chief Miller, also present, faced tough questions from the audience. While some residents expressed frustration, others applauded his willingness to engage. Miller committed to implementing new policies, including independent reviews of use of force incidents and increased transparency in officer discipline. To further solidify these efforts, Cecilia helped organize a comprehensive training program for law enforcement. Partnering with civil rights groups and experienced trainers, she crafted a curriculum that focused on implicit bias, de-escalation tactics, and community-centered policing. In one session, officers were confronted with real-life scenarios that challenged their perceptions. They watched reenactments of situations like Cecilia's traffic stop, followed by discussions on how the officer could have handled the encounter differently. An officer raised his hand during a session on bias. "It's hard to admit that we might carry biases, even subconsciously," he said. "But I see now how those biases can lead to bad decisions. This training is uncomfortable, but it's necessary." Cecilia addressed the group directly. "Acknowledging bias isn't a weakness. It's the first step toward change. Policing should never be about ego or assumptions. It should be about fairness and integrity." Cecilia's efforts extended beyond the police force. She worked with schools and community centers to educate young people about their rights when interacting with law enforcement. She also collaborated with local artists to create public murals depicting themes of justice and equality, turning the city's streets into a canvas for hope and progress. During one community event, a local leader presented Cecilia with a bronze eagle statuette. "This eagle symbolizes freedom, courage, and resilience," he said. "Just like you, Cecilia." Humbled, Cecilia accepted the gift, but quickly announced her decision to donate it to a local youth organization. "This belongs to the community," she said. "Let it serve as a reminder of what we can achieve together." The gesture resonated deeply, further solidifying Cecilia's image as a leader committed to collective progress rather than personal recognition. As the reforms gained traction, opposition inevitably emerged. A small but vocal group accused Cecilia of undermining law enforcement. "All this so-called reform is just tying the hands of good officers," one critic said during a city council meeting. Cecilia remained steadfast, addressing the criticism head-on. "True reform doesn't weaken law enforcement. It strengthens it. A system that holds officers accountable builds trust with the community, making everyone safer. Accountability isn't an attack on good officers. It's a safeguard against bad ones. Her words earned applause from most in attendance, but she knew the road ahead would still be challenging. By the end of the month, the city had passed several key reforms. Mandatory bias and de-escalation training, required for all officers on an annual basis. Independent Oversight Board, tasked with reviewing misconduct cases and ensuring transparency in disciplinary actions. Community policing programs, designed to foster positive relationships between officers and residents through regular engagement outside of enforcement scenarios. Cecilia's leadership was pivotal in these changes, but she refused to take sole credit. "This is a victory for the entire community," she said in a televised interview. "Real change comes from collective action." Cecilia Harris sat in her modest living room, surrounded by a few mementos of her military career and recent reform work. The events of the past few weeks replayed in her mind like a vivid reel. The confrontation with Turner, the press conference, the countless discussions with leaders and community members. For most people, the ordeal would have been a chapter to close and move on from. But for Cecilia, it was a turning point, one that redefined her purpose. This wasn't just about her. The traffic stop had become a flashpoint, exposing cracks in a system long overdue for change. The public outcry wasn't only a reaction to one officer's actions, it was a demand for something greater, a collective refusal to let injustice go unchallenged. "I can't walk away from this," Cecilia thought aloud. "Not when so many people are still facing the same struggles without the platform I've been given." The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Aaron Blake from the Civil Rights Alliance. "Cecilia, we've received over 300 messages in the last week from people who saw your speech and want to get involved. Your story is inspiring people to act." Cecilia smiled faintly. "It's not my story that matters, Aaron. It's theirs. The ones who faced this kind of injustice in silence for years. This is their fight as much as mine." "Well, they're ready to fight," Aaron replied. "We've got enough interest to launch a national campaign, but it's going to need a face, someone who can lead by example. Think you're up for it?" Cecilia paused, her mind turning over the implications. She had always preferred action over attention, results over recognition. But this wasn't about personal glory. It was about creating a platform for change. "I'll do it," she said finally, "but only if the focus stays on the work. This can't become about me." As the campaign took shape, Cecilia spent her days crisscrossing the city and beyond, meeting with activists, policymakers, and everyday citizens. She listened to stories from people who had endured profiling, harassment, and worse. One story, in particular, stayed with her. A single mother named Angela recounted how her teenage son was stopped and frisked while walking home from school because an officer thought he looked out of place. "They told him he matched the description of someone they were looking for," Angela said, her voice trembling. "But they didn't have a description. They just saw a black boy with a hoodie and assumed he was guilty." Cecilia's response was measured but firm. No child should have to grow up fearing the people sworn to protect them. This is why we fight. For him. For every kid who deserves better. The more Cecilia delved into the work, the more she realized how deeply systemic the problems were. It wasn't just about rogue officers like Turner. It was about the structures that enabled them. The culture of policing needed to change from the inside out, and that required more than policy. It demanded a shift in values. Cecilia began meeting with police academies, pushing for reforms at the training level. "We need to start here," she told a group of recruits. "Bias doesn't just disappear when you put on a uniform. A badge doesn't make you infallible. It holds you to a higher standard." Her words resonated with many of the recruits, but not all. One young man raised his hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, with respect, how are we supposed to do our jobs if we're constantly second-guessing ourselves? Policing is dangerous." Cecilia didn't shy away from the challenge. "Policing is dangerous," she acknowledged. "But so is letting fear and assumptions guide your actions. You're not here to control communities. You're here to serve them. If you don't understand that, you're in the wrong profession." Even as progress was made, resistance persisted. Conservative commentators labeled Cecilia a troublemaker and accused her of undermining law enforcement. At a town hall meeting, One resident stood up and said bluntly, "You're trying to fix something that's not broken. Not all cops are bad." Cecilia's reply was as sharp as it was calm. "You're right. Most officers are good people trying to do their jobs. But even one bad officer can destroy lives. Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. It makes us complicit." The room fell silent. Even those who disagreed couldn't argue with her logic. Through it all, Cecilia remained driven by the lessons she had learned from her own experience. The most important of these was the power of persistence. Change didn't come quickly or easily, but every step forward mattered. In a quiet moment, she reflected on the irony of her journey. She had spent her military career fighting external threats, only to find herself battling injustices at home. But this fight felt just as vital, if not more so. "Equality isn't optional," she said to herself one evening. "It's the foundation of everything we claim to stand for. If we don't protect it, what are we fighting for?" Her work began to bear fruit in ways she hadn't anticipated. Young activists cited her as a role model, and new coalitions formed across the country, inspired by her efforts. A high school teacher wrote to tell her how her story had sparked a classroom debate that led to students organizing their own community forum. At one such event, a teenager approached her with tears in his eyes. "Thank you for standing up," he said. "Because of you, I don't feel invisible anymore." The moment was humbling. Cecilia knelt slightly to meet his gaze. "You were never invisible," she told him. "You're stronger than you realize. Keep fighting." The campaign expanded into a full-fledged movement, with Cecilia at its heart. She pushed for legislation requiring independent oversight of all police departments and worked with educators to include civic engagement and rights awareness in school curriculums. But she never let the movement lose sight of its roots. Every victory was dedicated to those whose voices had been ignored for too long. The momentum Cecilia Harris had sparked grew into a wildfire of collective action. Across the city and beyond, discussions about systemic racism and police reform shifted from private conversations to public forums, classrooms, and town halls. What had once been whispered frustrations became bold declarations, amplified by a growing number of voices demanding accountability and justice. At the heart of this movement were young people, energized and unafraid to challenge the status quo. High schools and universities organized workshops on racial equity, encouraging students to examine biases and advocate for change. Social media platforms became hubs for sharing stories and coordinating grassroots actions. One evening, Cecilia was invited to speak at a youth-led rally in the park. The crowd was larger than she'd expected. Hundreds of people, many holding signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Systemic Racism." As she stepped onto the stage, the cheers were deafening, a testament to how deeply her message had resonated. Cecilia began without preamble. "This movement isn't about one person or one event. It's about all of us, standing together to demand a future where equality isn't a dream. It's a reality. Change doesn't happen because we wish for it. It happens because we fight for it, every single day." After the rally, a young woman approached Cecilia with tears in her eyes. "I've been afraid to speak out for so long," she admitted. "But seeing you stand up made me realize I can do the same. Thank you for giving me the courage." Cecilia placed a hand on her shoulder. "The courage was always there," she said. "You just needed a reason to use it. Now go make it count." As the movement gained traction, tangible changes began to unfold in the community. Local leaders, spurred by public pressure, introduced new initiatives aimed at fostering trust between law enforcement and residents. Community policing programs were expanded, pairing officers with neighborhoods to build relationships outside of enforcement contexts. One such program hosted monthly Coffee with a Cop events, where residents could voice concerns directly to officers in an informal setting. At the first session, tensions ran high, with several attendees venting years of pent-up frustration. "You don't understand what it's like to live in fear every time you see a patrol car," one man said bluntly. An officer replied, "And you don't understand what it's like to wonder if every call will be your last." The exchange was heated, but Cecilia stepped in, diffusing the tension with a firm yet empathetic tone. "Both of you are speaking from pain," she said. "But if we let that pain divide us, we'll never find solutions. Let's start by listening to each other." By the end of the session, progress was visible. While disagreements remained, The willingness to engage was a step forward. Cecilia's influence extended beyond her city. She was invited to participate in national panels on police reform, sharing her story and the strategies that had worked in her community. At one event, a senator commended her efforts. "Ms. Harris, you've accomplished more in a few months than some of us have managed in years," he said. Cecilia's response was measured but firm. "That's because change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from discomfort, from confrontation, from holding ourselves accountable. If you want to see progress, you can't be afraid to shake the foundations." The movement wasn't without resistance. A small but vocal group criticized the reforms, arguing that they undermined law enforcement. At a contentious city council meeting, one attendee declared, "These changes are making officers hesitant to do their jobs. What happens when criminals take advantage of that?" Cecilia's reply was swift. "No one is asking officers to hesitate. We're asking them to think, to see people as individuals, not threats. If that makes policing harder, so be it. Protecting lives isn't supposed to be easy." Her words were met with applause from supporters, while detractors fumed in silence. As the months passed, Cecilia became a symbol of resilience and hope. Her face graced murals, her quotes appeared on protest signs, and her story inspired countless others to take up the fight for justice. But she remained grounded, always redirecting praise back to the collective effort. "This isn't my movement," she often said. "It belongs to everyone who believes in fairness, dignity, and equality." One evening, Cecilia attended a gathering at a community center where local artists unveiled a mural dedicated to the movement. The centerpiece was an image of Cecilia herself, surrounded by silhouettes representing the diverse voices of the community. Above it, bold letters read, "Together, we rise." Cecilia stared at the mural for a long moment, then turned to the artists. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But this movement isn't about me. It's about all of you and the future you're building." Her humility only deepened the community's admiration for her. Years after the night Cecilia Harris stood her ground during that fateful traffic stop, her name had become synonymous with courage and transformation. Across the nation, people referenced her as an example of what one person could achieve when they refused to accept the unacceptable. Her impact extended far beyond the city where it all began. Laws were passed, training protocols were overhauled, and independent oversight boards became mandatory in many jurisdictions. Yet for Cecilia, the greatest triumph wasn't in policy. It was in the shift she saw in people's hearts and minds. At a national civil rights conference, Cecilia delivered a closing speech to a packed auditorium. The crowd fell silent as she stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding yet unassuming. "We often think of change as something monumental," she began, "but real change begins in the smallest of moments. It starts when someone speaks up instead of staying silent. It grows when a community chooses solidarity over division. And it flourishes when leaders take responsibility, not just for their actions, but for the systems they oversee." Her voice grew firmer. "The story of my fight is not unique. It's the story of countless others who faced injustice and found the strength to resist. The only difference is that my story was seen. My challenge to all of you is this: don't let those unseen stories go unheard. Seek them out. Lift them up. That's how we create lasting change." The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Cecilia stood humbly, acknowledging the crowd with a small nod before stepping back. Her legacy also lived on in the lives she touched directly. Jamal, the young man who had spoken at one of her forums, now led a youth organization dedicated to empowering marginalized communities. "Ms. Harris taught me that we don't have to wait for someone else to make things right," he told a group of high school students. "We are the ones we've been waiting for." Sarah Johnson, the woman who had recorded Cecilia's encounter with Turner, had become a journalist, using her platform to highlight issues of inequality and systemic reform. "Cecilia didn't just inspire me to act that night," Sarah said in an interview. "She taught me that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right." In her city, the police department had transformed under Chief Miller's leadership. New recruits were required to complete extensive bias training and engage in community outreach programs as part of their onboarding. Officers were held to higher standards of accountability, and the culture of the force had begun to shift towards service and transparency. At a swearing-in ceremony for a new class of officers, Miller spoke about the impact Cecilia had made. "Ms. Harris reminded us of what it truly means to serve," he said. "Her unwavering stand wasn't just a call for justice. It was a call for us to be better, to earn the trust we often take for granted. That's a lesson I hope each of you carries into your careers." Cecilia, sitting quietly in the audience, smiled faintly, but said nothing. She had never sought recognition. She only wanted results. Despite her influence, Cecilia never stopped pushing for more. She continued to work with legislators, community leaders, and educators to address inequities beyond policing. From advocating for affordable housing to supporting programs for underprivileged youth, she broadened her fight to encompass all aspects of systemic inequality. When asked in an interview why she kept going, Cecilia's answer was simple: because the work isn't finished. Justice isn't a destination. It's a constant effort. And I'll keep walking this path as long as I'm able. As the years passed, Cecilia's story became a cornerstone in the national conversation about equality and justice. Her name was added to textbooks, her speeches studied in classrooms, and her image immortalized in murals and public art. But she never saw herself as a hero. One evening, a reporter asked her how she wanted to be remembered. Cecilia paused before replying. "Not as a hero," she said quietly, "but as someone who refused to let injustice have the final word. If I've done that, I've done enough." Her humility only added to her impact. People from all walks of life found inspiration in her resilience and clarity of purpose. To them, Cecilia represented the best of humanity, the willingness to stand firm, even when the odds seemed insurmountable, and the ability to turn personal pain into a catalyst for collective progress. In her final public appearance, a town hall organized to celebrate the progress her community had made, Cecilia spoke directly to the next generation. "This fight doesn't belong to me," she said. "It belongs to you now. Take what we've built and make it stronger. Make it fairer, and never stop asking how we can do better." The room erupted in applause, a fitting tribute to a woman who had dedicated her life to ensuring that others could live with dignity and equality. Cecilia Harris's story was never just about one traffic stop or one officer's misconduct. It was a reminder that standing up to injustice, no matter how daunting, has the power to ripple outward, transforming not just individuals, but entire systems. Her life's work proved a simple truth. When we fight for equality, we don't just change policies, we change society. And in doing so, we honor the humanity in all of us. What would you do if faced with a moment that called for such bravery? Would you rise to the challenge like Cecilia did and fight for what's right? If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share and subscribe to the channel to help amplify stories of resilience and hope. Together, we can spark conversations that lead to real change.
Jonathan Parker adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, a quiet show of elegance as he parked his sleek black car on a bustling downtown street. The late afternoon sun reflected off the polished hood, drawing the attention of passers-by. He stepped out with purpose, phone in hand, as he listened intently to the caller on the other end. On the surface, it was an ordinary scene in the heart of a vibrant American city. But Jonathan couldn't shake the faint sense of unease that crept into his chest every time he parked his luxury car in a public space. He dismissed the thought as paranoia and turned his attention back to the conversation. He had noticed the police cruiser roll to a slow stop a few yards away. From the driver's seat, Officer Michael Grant narrowed his eyes. His expression, one of suspicion masked his duty, sharpened as he focused on the man standing beside the luxury car. Something about the situation struck a nerve he couldn't ignore or wouldn't. Grant's boots clicked against the pavement as he approached. "Sir," he said curtly, his voice clipped. Jonathan turned to face him, lowering the phone and offering a polite nod. "Officer, can I help you?" Jonathan's tone was calm but firm, practiced over years of navigating interactions like these. Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned the car, then Jonathan. His posture stiffened, as if bracing for conflict. "Is this your vehicle?" Jonathan felt his jaw tighten. "Yes, it is," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Is there an issue?" The officer gestured toward the car, his hand resting on the edge of his utility belt. "Looks a little out of place here. Mind if I see some ID and registration?" The request wasn't unusual, but the way Grant delivered it set Jonathan on edge. He met the officer's gaze evenly, reluctant but knowing he couldn't refuse. "Sure." He reached into his pocket and retrieved his wallet. A crowd began to gather, murmurs spreading through the street as the interaction unfolded. Several people instinctively pulled out their phones, recording what felt like another example of racial profiling. Jonathan couldn't help but notice, and the weight of their eyes only deepened his unease. "Everything checks out," Jonathan said, holding out the documents. Grant barely glanced at them before dismissing them with a scoff. "This car looks like it's been reported stolen," Grant said flatly, ignoring the growing discontent of the crowd. "We're going to have to take a closer look." Jonathan froze. The words weren't unfamiliar, but the voice was. He studied the officer more closely, a fragment of memory surfacing like a splinter beneath his skin. Something about this man's face, a flicker of recognition mixed with an old wound. "Have we met before?" Jonathan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Grant's lip twitched, his tone turning sharp. "Just doing my job, sir. Hand over the keys." The crowd stirred, voices rising in protest. Jonathan stood his ground, refusing to give in without clarity. The faint memory grew louder in his mind, a haunting echo of a night from years ago. For now, though, he kept his composure, reaching for his phone. "I'm calling someone," he said, his voice firm. "I have the right to make this right." He dialed a number, his voice steady but clipped. "Robert, it's me. I need your help." The tension thickened as he hung up, leaving both the officer and the growing crowd to wonder. Why did this man seem so calm in the face of such blatant injustice? Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and everything would soon unravel. But for Jonathan, the officer's face had already done enough. The late afternoon sun bathed the street in golden light, but Jonathan Parker felt anything but warmth. Standing beside his car, he held his hands visibly at his sides, his documents neatly prepared in one hand, while Officer Michael Grant loomed over him with a skeptical glare. "Is this your vehicle?" Grant asked again, his voice louder now, as though Jonathan hadn't already answered. Jonathan forced a breath. "Yes, officer. I provided my ID and registration, as you requested. Everything should be in order." Grant took the documents, holding them as if they were an afterthought. He didn't bother reading them. Instead, his gaze darted from Jonathan to the car, his brow furrowed as though piecing together a puzzle that didn't exist. The growing crowd shifted uneasily, their quiet murmurs thick with tension. Several phones were already pointed at the scene, lenses capturing every second. Jonathan noticed, but he didn't dare look away from the officer. "This car doesn't belong here," Grant said, the statement as flat as it was accusatory. He gestured to the sleek black vehicle. "How does a guy like you afford something like this?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'm a business owner," he replied, careful to keep his tone measured. "I've worked hard to earn everything I have, including this car. If you need further proof..." "I'll tell you what I need," Grant interrupted, stepping closer, his hand resting on his utility belt. "I need you to stop acting like you've got nothing to hide. Keys. Now." Jonathan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every eye in the crowd. The officer's words stung, but the way he said them, the deliberate disregard, the air of superiority, was like a slap in the face. "Officer, I've complied with your requests," he said, his voice tight but steady. "If there's an issue, I'd appreciate it if you explained." "The issue," Grant cut in, his tone icy, "is that this car doesn't look like it belongs to you. And until I verify otherwise, it's my responsibility to investigate. So, unless you want to make this harder on yourself, hand over the keys." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "That's not right," but the officer didn't flinch. Jonathan stared at Grant, a storm of emotions swirling beneath his composed exterior. He glanced at the crowd, their phones recording, their faces sympathetic but helpless. Finally, he reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, and handed the keys over. Grant snatched them with a smirk that made Jonathan's stomach churn. "That's better," the officer said, dangling the keys for a moment before pocketing them. "Now, step back while I run the plates." Jonathan obeyed, retreating a few steps, but refusing to lower his gaze. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he watched Grant walk around the car, inspecting it like it was a crime scene. From the crowd, a woman's voice called out, "Why are you treating him like this? He gave you everything you asked for." "Ma'am, stay out of it," Grant barked without turning around. "This is official business." "Does official business include harassing an innocent man?" the woman shot back. Jonathan met her eyes briefly, a silent nod of thanks, but he quickly refocused on the officer. He knew better than to let his guard down. Grant finished his inspection and walked back, his expression unreadable. "Plates check out," he muttered, but his tone didn't soften. "Still, I'm going to hold on to these keys until we figure this out." "This is outrageous," Jonathan said, his voice firmer now. "You verified the plates, you have my registration, and I've done nothing wrong. What more do you need?" "What I need," Grant sneered, leaning in slightly, "is to make sure this isn't stolen. People like you, well, let's just say I've seen this kind of thing before." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. He knew what the officer meant, even if he didn't say it outright. The words hung in the air, a silent indictment of his skin color, his success, his very existence in that moment. "You're making a mistake," Jonathan said, his voice low but resolute. "And I promise you, this isn't going to end the way you think it will." Grant chuckled, a sound that made Jonathan's skin crawl. "We'll see about that." From the crowd, another voice rang out. "This is racial profiling. Somebody call a lawyer." The crowd's agitation grew, their voices louder, their recordings more deliberate. Still, Grant didn't back down. "I suggest you all disperse," he said, his hand hovering near his holster. "This is a private matter." "No, it's not," someone shouted. "This is public abuse of power." Jonathan's heart pounded as he realized how quickly the situation could spiral out of control. He raised a hand, addressing the crowd. "Please stay calm," he said. "I'll handle this." His words were measured, but inside, he was reeling. He glanced at Grant one last time, memorizing every detail of his face. Then he pulled out his phone, his hands trembling only slightly, and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Robert," he said when the line connected. His voice, despite everything, was steady. "I need your help. Right now." The officer's smirk faltered as Jonathan hung up, the resolve in his tone undeniable. The crowd quieted slightly, sensing that something was about to happen. Grant crossed his arms, feigning indifference, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. "Who are you calling?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Jonathan's eyes locked on his. "You'll find out soon enough." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. For the first time, Grant's confidence seemed to waver, his gaze darting nervously toward the crowd. Jonathan stood tall, his dignity intact despite the humiliation, as he waited for the storm he had unleashed to arrive. The sound of sirens grew louder, their sharp wail cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade. The crowd had swelled, dozens of faces now watching intently, their phones still raised, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Jonathan Parker stood his ground, his expression calm, but his chest tight with anger and humiliation. Across from him, Officer Michael Grant shifted uneasily, his earlier arrogance starting to crack under the weight of the moment. "What's going on here?" a voice from the crowd demanded. "Why aren't you giving him his car back?" Grant ignored the question, focusing instead on Jonathan. "Who'd you call?" he asked, his tone harsh but laced with unease. Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted his tie with deliberate calm, his gaze steady. "Someone who can make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." The officer's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, 2 squad cars pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing. Several officers stepped out, their faces a mix of confusion and caution as they surveyed the scene. Among them was Sergeant Claire Martinez, a no-nonsense veteran with a reputation for fairness. Her sharp eyes darted between Jonathan, the agitated crowd, and Grant, who looked increasingly out of his depth. "Grant, Martinez said, her tone clipped as she approached. What's the situation here? Grant straightened, trying to reclaim his authority. Routine vehicle check, Sergeant. This man's car looks suspicious, so I stopped to verify ownership. Martinez frowned, glancing at Jonathan, who stood silently but held himself with an unmistakable air of dignity. She turned back to Grant. And did you verify it? Grant hesitated, and the pause was telling. The plates matched the registration, he admitted grudgingly. But I thought it best to investigate further, just to be sure. To be sure of what? Exactly? Martinez pressed, her voice sharp. It sounds like you already had everything you needed. Grant shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing against the pocket where he'd stashed Jonathan's keys. I was following protocol. Martinez's eyes narrowed. Protocol doesn't involve confiscating keys without cause. She stepped closer, her tone low but firm. Hand them over. The crowd murmured their approval, a wave of murmurs rippling through them as Grant reluctantly pulled the keys from his pocket and placed them in Martinez's outstretched hand. She turned and walked over to Jonathan, her expression softening slightly. Mr. Parker, I apologize for the inconvenience, she said, handing him the keys. You're free to go. Jonathan took them, his grip firm but his face unreadable. Thank you, he said quietly. He turned to unlock the car but stopped short, glancing back at Grant. This isn't the first time, he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet anger. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Martinez tilted her head. What do you mean? Jonathan's eyes locked onto Grant's, and for the first time, the officer looked truly uncomfortable. We've met before, Jonathan continued. A few years ago. Different city, different car, same treatment. He pulled me over for a so-called broken taillight that wasn't broken. Spent 20 minutes interrogating me about where I could afford a vehicle like mine. The crowd gasped, and even Martinez's expression shifted, her professionalism momentarily giving way to surprise. Is that true, Grant? She asked sharply. Grant's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I don't recall that, he muttered, but his flushed face betrayed him. You don't recall? Jonathan repeated, his voice rising slightly. You don't recall humiliating me on the side of the road for no reason other than the color of my skin? You don't recall calling me boy when I asked for an explanation? The crowd erupted, voices shouting in outrage. That's disgusting, someone yelled. He should lose his badge. Martinez raised her hands, calling for calm. Enough, she barked, silencing the crowd. She turned back to Grant, her gaze icy. We'll discuss this back at the station, she said curtly. For now, you're relieved of duty. Grant's face turned a deep shade of red. What? He sputtered. You can't. I just did, Martinez snapped. Get in your cruiser and wait. Grant hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of self-preservation. Finally, he turned on his heel and stalked back to his car, slamming the door behind him. Martinez exhaled and turned back to Jonathan. Mr. Parker again, I'm sorry for what happened here. I'll make sure this is handled properly. Jonathan nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. We'll see, he said simply. He opened the car door and slid inside, but before he could pull away, another car arrived, a sleek, black SUV that immediately drew everyone's attention. The crowd parted as the vehicle stopped, and a tall man stepped out, his presence commanding. Dressed in a crisp suit with a pin bearing the state's emblem, he was instantly recognizable. It was Robert Parker, the governor. The crowd erupted into a flurry of murmurs and gasps. Phones rose higher, eager to capture the unfolding spectacle. Robert strode toward Jonathan's car, his face a mask of controlled fury. Jonathan, he said, his voice carrying authority and concern. Jonathan stepped out of the car, his earlier composure cracking slightly. Robert, he said, his voice heavy. Thanks for coming. Robert turned, his sharp gaze landing on Martinez. What happened here? He demanded. Martinez explained quickly and concisely, her professionalism intact despite the mounting pressure. As she spoke, Robert's expression darkened, his jaw tightening with every detail. When she finished, he turned to the crowd, his voice firm. This behavior is unacceptable, he said. I will personally see to it that this incident is investigated and justice is served. No one, regardless of their position, is above accountability." The crowd cheered, their anger finding a temporary outlet in his words. Robert placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, squeezing it briefly. "You deserve better than this," he said softly. Jonathan's eyes met his brother's, and for the first time that day, a flicker of relief crossed his face. But beneath it, the weight of the moment lingered, a stark reminder that the fight for dignity and justice was far from over. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. As the crowd buzzed with a mixture of anger and excitement, Robert Parker turned to face them fully. His posture was steady, but the fury in his voice was unmistakable. "This is not just about my brother," he began, addressing the onlookers and the cameras that were undoubtedly live-streaming the event to every corner of the internet. "This is about accountability, about dignity, about ensuring that every single person, no matter their background, is treated with the respect they deserve." The crowd cheered, their energy a volatile mix of hope and frustration. Jonathan stood nearby, watching his brother take control of the narrative, but his mind was elsewhere. The memory of his previous encounter with Officer Grant was no longer just a faint scar. It was a vivid wound, now reopened for the world to see. Robert turned to Sergeant Martinez, who stood at attention, her face calm, but her eyes troubled. "I need an immediate inquiry into Officer Grant's conduct," Robert said firmly. "This isn't the first time he's behaved this way." Martinez nodded, already pulling out her phone to make calls. "I'll start the process," she said. "There's no excuse for what happened here." As the sergeant worked, Robert stepped closer to Jonathan. His voice dropped to a lower, more personal tone. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning his brother's face for any sign of distress. Jonathan hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I'm fine," he said, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. "This isn't the first time, Robert. You know that." Robert's jaw tightened. "I do," he admitted, his tone heavy with regret. "And I hate that it's taken something this public for me to act. But I promise you, this ends today." Before Jonathan could respond, a voice from the crowd interrupted. "Governor Parker! Governor Parker!" A journalist pushed through the throng, her camera operator close behind. "Do you believe this incident reflects systemic issues in law enforcement?" Robert's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he glanced at Jonathan. His brother's expression was guarded, but his eyes conveyed a silent plea. "Don't sugarcoat this." "It absolutely does," Robert said, turning back to the journalist. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a culture of bias that has gone unchecked for far too long. As governor, I've worked to address these issues, but clearly there's much more to be done." Jonathan felt a pang of frustration. He knew his brother meant well, but words, especially from a politician, always felt insufficient. Still, he held his tongue, unwilling to make this moment about their personal differences. The journalist pressed further. "What do you say to those who argue that these incidents are isolated and not reflective of larger patterns?" Robert's gaze hardened. "I'd say they're ignoring reality. When incidents like this happen repeatedly, to my brother and to countless others, it's not isolated. It's systemic, and it demands systemic solutions." The crowd cheered again, but Jonathan barely registered the noise. His mind was back in the past, replaying his first encounter with Grant. It had been years ago, on a quiet stretch of road late at night. The officer's sneering voice, his dismissive attitude, the way he'd treated Jonathan like a criminal for daring to drive a nice car. It all came rushing back with sickening clarity. "Jonathan," Robert said gently, breaking him out of his thoughts. "Do you want to say something?" Jonathan looked up, startled. The crowd had quieted, their eyes now fixed on him. He hesitated, the weight of their expectation pressing down on him. He cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "I don't have much to say that hasn't already been said, but I will say this. This isn't about me. This is about every person who's ever been treated as less than because of who they are or how they look. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through this." The crowd erupted into applause, but Jonathan barely heard it. He turned back to Robert, his voice low. "This doesn't end with a speech. You know that." Robert nodded, his expression serious. I know. At that moment, another car pulled up, this one an unmarked sedan. A man in a suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. Jonathan recognized him immediately. Thomas Avery, Robert's chief of staff, and one of the most ruthless strategists in the state's political machine. Governor, Avery said, ignoring the crowd as he approached. We need to contain this. The press is already running with the story, and it's going viral. Robert's expression darkened. Contain it? This isn't something to contain, Thomas. This is something to confront. Avery's lips thinned, but he didn't argue. Understood. But you'll need to address this formally soon. The opposition is already framing it as you using your office to protect a family member. Jonathan scoffed, unable to stay silent. Protect a family member? Is that what they think this is about? Avery looked at him, his expression unreadable. It's politics, Mr. Parker. Perception matters. Jonathan shook his head, disgusted but unsurprised. Then maybe it's time to change the perception. Robert placed a calming hand on Jonathan's shoulder. We will, he said firmly. But we have to be smart about this. As the conversation continued, Martinez returned, her face grim. Governor, Mr. Parker, she said. I've checked the records. Officer Grant has had multiple complaints filed against him, most of them for racially biased behavior. Jonathan's stomach turned, even as a bitter sense of vindication washed over him. And none of them went anywhere, did they? He asked, already knowing the answer. Martinez shook her head. No, all of them were dismissed. Robert's expression hardened. That changes today, he said. I want a full investigation into those complaints, and I want transparency. No more sweeping things under the rug. Jonathan watched his brother, a flicker of something like hope sparking in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like Robert truly understood what was at stake, not just for him, but for everyone who had been wronged. But even as the pieces began to fall into place, Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. There were more battles to fight, more truths to uncover, and he would make sure none of it was ignored again. The crowd's energy had shifted. The initial tension of the confrontation had given way to a charged anticipation. People weren't just watching now, they were invested. Jonathan could see it in their faces as they whispered among themselves, their cameras still recording. He glanced at Robert, who was deep in conversation with Sergeant Martinez. Avery hovered nearby, his phone in hand, likely already spinning the narrative to control the political fallout. Jonathan leaned against his car, the keys cold in his hand, and let out a slow breath. The humiliation he'd endured wasn't new, but the public nature of it this time had stripped him of the armor he usually carried. He wasn't just a businessman or a victim in this moment. He was a symbol, and that terrified him. Hey, Robert said, stepping closer. His voice had softened, the political edge replaced by a brotherly concern that felt almost foreign. I'm going to make sure Grant is held accountable. Jonathan met his brother's gaze, his expression guarded. And then what? Another press conference? Another promise to do better? This doesn't stop with him, Robert. You know that. Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, he admitted, and I don't have all the answers yet. But I'm trying. Trying isn't enough, Jonathan said quietly, the words cutting. He didn't want to be cruel, but he also couldn't hold back. You have power, influence. Use it. Before Robert could respond, a commotion from the crowd drew their attention. A young woman, her voice shaking with both anger and emotion, stepped forward. She held her phone high, broadcasting live to her followers. This isn't just about Jonathan Parker, she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. This is about every black man and woman who's been stopped, questioned, humiliated, or worse, for no reason other than the color of their skin. And we're tired of it. The crowd roared in agreement, their voices rising in a unified demand for change. Jonathan felt a pang of pride at her courage, but it was quickly overshadowed by a wave of exhaustion. The weight of their expectations pressed down on him like a lead blanket. Robert stepped forward, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. She's right, he said, his voice carrying the same authority he used in the State House. This is bigger than one person or one incident. And as your governor, I promise you, I will not let this moment pass without action. The crowd cheered again, But Jonathan noticed a flicker of doubt in some faces. Words were easy, actions weren't. As the noise settled, Sergeant Martinez approached again, this time with a clipboard in hand. "Governor, Mr. Parker," she began, "I've initiated the internal investigation. Officer Grant will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome." "Leave?" Jonathan echoed, his voice sharp. "That's it? After everything he's done?" Martinez held his gaze, her expression steady. "It's protocol, Mr. Parker. I can't do more until the investigation is complete." Jonathan shook his head, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Protocol," he muttered bitterly. "It's always protocol when it comes to us." "Jonathan," Robert said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This is a start. It's not enough, but it's a step." Jonathan shrugged off his brother's hand, his voice rising. "A start? Robert, I've had enough of starts. Every time this happens, it's the same story. Investigations that lead nowhere. Promises that go unfulfilled. And meanwhile, people like Grant get to walk away, their lives intact, while we're left to pick up the pieces." The crowd had gone quiet, their attention shifting entirely to the exchange between the two brothers. Robert looked at Jonathan, his face a mixture of guilt and determination. "You're right," he said finally, "and I won't let this be another empty promise. But I need your help." "My help?" Jonathan asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "You're the governor, Robert. What do you need me for?" Robert took a deep breath. "Because this can't just come from me. If it does, people will see it as political posturing. But if it comes from you, from someone who's lived it, it'll mean more." Jonathan stared at his brother, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to say no, to walk away and leave Robert to deal with the mess on his own. But another part, the part that couldn't ignore the pain in the faces of the crowd, knew he couldn't turn his back. "What are you asking me to do?" he said finally. Robert hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Join me in pushing for real reform. Help me draft policies that will make a difference. Be the voice that I can't be." Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat, the enormity of the request sinking in. "You're asking me to be a symbol," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to be a leader," Robert corrected. "Because that's what you already are." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Jonathan looked at the crowd, their expectant faces a mirror of his own conflicted emotions. He thought of the young woman who'd spoken up, the courage in her voice. He thought of every time he'd been stopped, questioned, doubted, simply for existing. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said, "but this has to be real, Robert. No half measures. No politics as usual. If I'm doing this, it's all or nothing." Robert smiled, relief washing over his face. "All or nothing," he agreed. As the brothers shook hands, a ripple of hope spread through the crowd. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a beginning, and for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like it might actually lead somewhere. But as the crowd began to disperse and the cameras turned away, Jonathan couldn't shake the lingering feeling that this fight was far from over. Officer Grant might have been temporarily sidelined, but the system that enabled him was still intact. And Jonathan knew that taking it on would be the battle of a lifetime. The days following the incident felt like a whirlwind. Jonathan Parker found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never asked for, his name trending on every social media platform, his face on every news network. The video of Officer Michael Grant's confrontation with him had gone viral, sparking nationwide outrage and reigniting calls for police reform. Jonathan hadn't intended to become a symbol of racial injustice, but here he was, carrying the weight of a movement on his shoulders. In the governor's office, the mood was no less tense. Robert Parker had convened a special task force to investigate systemic racism within the state's law enforcement agencies. Jonathan had reluctantly agreed to be part of it, though the arrangement came with its own challenges. "It's politics, Jonathan," Robert had warned him during one of their late-night meetings. "You're going to have to learn to navigate the system if you want to change it." "I'm not here to play games, Robert," Jonathan had replied, his tone sharp. "I'm here to make sure what happened to me doesn't keep happening to others." Now, as Jonathan sat in the conference room, surrounded by advocates, lawyers, and law enforcement officials, he could feel the weight of every decision being made. The task force had spent hours drafting new policies, mandatory body cameras, comprehensive bias training, and a community oversight board to review complaints against officers. But even with these measures, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. "We need accountability," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "It's not just about training or oversight. It's about consequences. Officers like Grant can't keep walking away unscathed." Sergeant Martinez, who had been invited to represent the police force, nodded in agreement. "You're right," she said. "Accountability is key, but it has to be fair. Officers who act in good faith shouldn't feel like they're constantly under attack. And what about the people they're supposed to protect?" Jonathan shot back. "How fair is it for someone to be humiliated on the street for driving a car they worked hard to earn? How fair is it for complaints to be dismissed without real investigation?" The room fell silent, the tension thick. Robert leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "We're not leaving this room without a real solution," he said firmly. "Not this time." For the first time in years, Jonathan felt a glimmer of respect for his brother. Robert wasn't just making promises, he was taking action. And despite their differences, Jonathan was beginning to believe that they could make a difference together. A week later, Jonathan found himself standing in front of a packed auditorium. The governor's office had organized a public forum to present the task force's recommendations and invite feedback from the community. Jonathan had been hesitant to speak, but Robert had convinced him it was necessary. "You're the reason this conversation is happening," Robert had said. "People need to hear from you." As Jonathan stepped up to the microphone, he scanned the room. Faces of every age and background stared back at him, their expressions a mix of hope and expectation. He cleared his throat, his palms sweating despite the cool air. "I never wanted to be here," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I never wanted to be the face of something like this. But after what happened to me, and after seeing the outpouring of support from so many of you, I realized I didn't have a choice." He paused, letting the words sink in. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that's been allowed to continue for far too long. And while the measures we're proposing today are a step in the right direction, they're just that, a step." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Jonathan raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about policy. It's about culture, about accountability, about treating every person with the dignity and respect they deserve, no matter who they are or what they look like." He glanced at Robert, who nodded encouragingly from the sidelines. "And it's not just about me or my brother. It's about all of us. Because change doesn't happen from the top down. It happens when we all demand it." The applause this time was thunderous, filling the auditorium and spilling into the streets. Jonathan stepped back from the microphone, his chest heaving with emotion. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of clarity. The reforms passed quickly, fueled by the public's demand for action. Officer Grant was officially terminated after the investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct. Other officers with similar complaints faced disciplinary action, and for the first time, many of those complaints were re-examined with input from the new oversight board. Jonathan remained involved, but he also took a step back to focus on his business and his own healing. The experience had taken a toll on him, but it had also given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As for Robert, the incident marked a turning point in his career. He became an outspoken advocate for justice reform, working to implement similar measures at the state and national levels. Though he and Jonathan still clashed occasionally, their relationship had grown stronger, forged in the fire of shared struggle. One evening, months after the incident, the two brothers sat on the porch of Jonathan's home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Do you think we did enough?" Jonathan asked, his voice quiet. Robert took a sip of his drink, his expression thoughtful. "Enough? No, but we've started something. And sometimes that's the hardest part." Jonathan nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then let's make sure it doesn't stop here." Robert smiled, clinking his glass against Jonathan's. To not stopping, Jonathan echoed. And as the sun disappeared, leaving the sky painted with streaks of orange and purple, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not just for himself, but for a world that could and would change